updates and be part of our conversation squad.
Right, so the question of academic freedom, which over the last decade or so, as you're all no doubt aware, has been in the news across the world. So have a few other hot button topics: democracy, populism, autocracy, and I would like to suggest that these are not unrelated. So I'm going to begin with a reference to two sets of data that have an international coverage. The first is from the Swedish think tank VDEM, which estimates that close to 80% of the world's population today lives in countries where academic freedom is not well protected, at least not in practice. The annual democracy report from the same think tank estimates that a similar percentage of the world's population today lives in autocracies. Now, this is a parallel, but perhaps not a surprising one. It suggests that as democracy declines, academic freedom too tends to decline. India is no exception to this rule. From a once decent record of academic freedom, it is currently placed in the bottom 20 to 30% of countries on the Academic Freedom Index. And the fact that this parallels its downgrading on the democracy index from a liberal democracy to an electoral autocracy is arguably not a coincidence. A second compilation of data comes from the Academic Freedom Monitoring Project of a global network called Scholars at Risk, which for the period September 22 to September 23 has documented 243 incidents worldwide of the violation of academic freedom. And the categories that they use are pretty dire: killings, violence, disappearances, wrongful imprisonments, detention, wrongful prosecution, restrictions on travel, loss of position. 37 of these 243 incidents are from India, and the only country that reports more incidents is Iran, 48. And the other countries with incidents in 2 digits include Bangladesh, Turkey, and the United States of America. Now, these are very different countries, except for the fact that they mostly are or have recently been ruled by right-wing and/or authoritarian governments. Studies have shown, in fact, that across the world, academic freedom is affected by political institutions and by political ideology. And so improvements and declines in academic freedom will vary in accordance with the political history of a country. In the case of India, we need to acknowledge that such academic freedom as previously existed, or at least was assumed to exist, was not the result of a considered commitment to the principle of such freedom. To begin with, unlike many other countries, from Brazil to Germany to New Zealand, India does not have a legal or constitutional framework for academic freedom. It has some international law commitments. It's signed on to the ICESCR, but these are regarded as soft law and they are not translated into domestic legislation. It's also a signatory to the UNESCO recommendations of 1997 on academic freedom, but these are ultimately recommendations. A dozen Indian universities also in 1991-92 signed on to the Magna Carta Universitatum, but their adherence to those commitments these days is more in the breach than the observance. If you look at the list, you'll know what I mean. The courts have therefore, unsurprisingly, generally viewed academic freedom as a subset of the constitutionally guaranteed freedom of speech. Now, in contrast to this absence of a formal or legal commitment to academic freedom, India's commitment to democracy has been relatively more robust, even if democracy in practice has been flawed, imperfect, work in progress, all of that. And the restoration of the emergency, in a sense, of democracy after the emergency, showed, in a sense, how its value was understood and defended. By contrast, academic freedom existed more as a result of benign indifference rather than a robust or considered commitment to a principle. Apart from the occasional banning of a book, and these were usually or frequently works of fiction, and usually on the basis of offense to religious sentiments, these were tests of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. But specifically, academic freedom didn't really need to be defended before. But I want to emphasize that this is not because we lived in some pristine golden age of academic freedom. From colonial times to the present, universities have historically had very weak institutional autonomy. The kind of centralization, bureaucratization, politicization of our higher education system over time has had an adverse impact on our academic freedom. We need to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth that we rarely even recognize, that there were many constraints on our academic freedom in the past, which we experienced unthinkingly, accepted uncomplainingly for decades. We just saw them as natural. We didn't see them. We didn't recognize them as threats to academic freedom per se. And these were mostly in the nature of what one might call structural constraints on the autonomy of universities. Now, of course, mostly they did not translate into constraints on what we taught or what we researched or what we published. But they were constraints. Firstly, because the heavy hand of the educational bureaucracy always hovered over the public university, with everything from faculty recruitment, pay grades, security of tenure, mechanisms for promotion in the academic hierarchy, all of this being governed by the same principles as for civil servants. And secondly, because control over purely academic matters, things like the duration of a degree, what a degree will be called, the content of syllabi, or the minuscule research funding that would be available, vested in the educational bureaucracy rather than, as elsewhere in other countries, in university faculty. So we knew our autonomy was constrained, but we didn't see this as a problem of academic freedom, right? The Western definition of academic freedom has never taken account of conditions like these, because the structural conditions of our universities simply did not obtain in their universities. They could be concerned about freedom to teach, to publish, research, and so on, but they never needed to worry about centralized control over syllabi and reading lists and things of this kind. We also rarely protested the structural features of the governance of universities unless there was some palpably unjust administrative or arbitrary administrative action. For instance, the process for choosing vice-chancellors is the prerogative of government. We never questioned that, right? It's not the practice everywhere. Why is the president or governor of a state holding university offices, however symbolic? Or indeed, the presence of government nominees on selection committees and in the statutory bodies of universities. So these conditions already made for a situation in which state intervention, up to a point, was considered acceptable and normal, not just in the perception of the state, but in our own perception, self-perception. We were a department of state. In recent times, academic freedom has become an issue mainly because state intervention has become more manifestly political in a partisan way, and openly ideological. And the creation of these ideological conditions, whether through vigilante censorship or the legal intimidation of authors and publishers, had already begun even before a certain turn in national politics in 2014, which provided the opportunity to institutionalize them and to legitimize them. Since then, every aspect of academic freedom, as defined in the global north, has been imperiled. And what do I mean when I say every aspect? Let me quickly walk you through the main, one might say, almost universally recognized features of academic freedom. Over the last century or so, we find a common core of features in every notable declaration or recommendation on academic freedom, which is in essence seen to include the following. First, freedom of inquiry and research. With that, the freedom of academic exchange, the freedom to disseminate and publish the results of our research. Second, freedom of teaching within the university or college. Third, freedom of extramural utterance and action, including the freedom of teachers to express freely their opinion about the institution or system in which they work. And a fourth, more recent addition is freedom from institutional censorship and freedom to participate in professional or representative academic bodies. In recent times, as you would know simply from reading the newspapers, each of these has come under attack in India and elsewhere. And in India, the range and comprehensiveness of these attacks has been unprecedented. We hear every day about the politicization of appointments, not just of heads of universities, but even of faculty appointments at every level, about constraints on the freedom to teach, research, and disseminate knowledge, which have been held hostage to pressures of ideological conformity and compliance. In public universities, resisting such pressures, or even just questioning arbitrary administrative action, has been known to result in a range of punitive actions, threats to terminate services, threats of suspension, the denial of sabbatical leave, the stalling of promotions, the holding back of retirement benefits, the whole works. As for freedom to disseminate and publish the results of one's research, we have moved from the era of books being banned to an era in which books have simply been bullied into disappearance. Books and articles have been forced off the syllabi and reading lists. Publishers have been compelled to withdraw or pulp books under threats of legal action. And now, in order to avoid expensive and vexatious lawsuits, publishers now typically hire law firms to vet manuscripts for any content that could be construed as seditious or defamatory. These sorts of incidents not only make publishers risk-averse, they also encourage in scholars a tendency to self-censorship. Because we become wary of having our scholarship evaluated not by our peers, as it should be, but by easily offended members of the public, of the lay public, who probably never even opened a page and read it. And we are fearful of losing our scholarly achievements to unsolicited controversies, irrelevant controversies. So this is damaging. Freedom inside as well as outside the classroom is regularly undermined by the cancellation of lectures, seminars, films, plays. Within the classroom, teachers have been threatened by political groups just for referencing, say, Rohit Vemula in their lectures, or for teaching Foucault to introduce students to critiques of power relations in society. Outside the classroom, a status report prepared for the UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Opinion and Expression listed as many as 78 events only on the campuses of public central universities. In other words, not state universities and not private colleges. 78 events for which permission was denied by the college or university authorities, or if the event was held, then it was disrupted. Not long ago, you may recall that the principal of a law college in Indore was forced to resign because the college library had on its shelves a book titled Collective Violence and the Criminal Justice System. The author of the book was arrested because the book allegedly, and I emphasize allegedly, promotes, within quotes, Hindu phobia. Both the principal and the author of the offending book are Muslims, and it's hard to decide what one should be more outraged by. Outraged by the fact that the principal was forced to resign, or to weep at the fact, at the reasoning that the principal gave in his petition to the Supreme Court, which mercifully gave him relief. But what he wrote in his petition to the Supreme Court was that the book had been acquired by the library before he became principal. So, extramural freedom, exercised when university teachers express their opinions outside the university campus, whether as citizens participating in political activities or simply sharing views with the public. While the number of teachers who exercise their extramural freedom is typically not large, those that do have had to contend with harassment and sometimes even face false cases of political extremism. On the other hand, the student groups and associated vigilantes can perpetrate violence on campuses with impunity, physically attacking students and teachers, and of course, predictably enjoying immunity from the law. Now, the reason why the undermining of academic freedom on all these counts causes such alarm today is that, to go back to what I started with, even though historically we had neither legal protections for academic freedom nor a considered commitment to the principle, nevertheless, the exercise of a minimal level of academic freedom was still possible, even within the structural constraints of weak autonomy for public universities. I mean, there were ridiculous aberrations, of course, like the famous 82 topics handed down by the Gujarat government in 2016 as PhD topics, mostly intended to be puff pieces for the government's development programs. But today, the range and comprehensiveness of the assault on academic freedom compels us to go beyond, not just recognize our historically weak commitment to this principle, but to consider a more robust defense of it. So, all the international declarations and recommendations that I mentioned earlier have tried to define the principle, deconstruct it into its various elements, and specify what exactly the requirements of academic freedom are. But they take the value of academic freedom to be self-evident. They don't offer us arguments for defending the principle, for justifying the principle of academic freedom itself. And that's, in a sense, what I'm going to try and do before you this afternoon. To place before you a few arguments for why academic freedom matters, why it should be valued and defended, what it is for, and what is entailed when it is curtailed or compromised. Why do we, indeed, why should we care about academic freedom? What are its relationships to the purposes of higher education and democracy? So I give you 5 interrelated arguments for academic freedom. First, the social value of scholarship. Now, why is academic freedom seen as a universal right and one that is fundamental to scientific progress and the pursuit of truth? I should mention that academic freedom has been described as a right even very recently by a UN working group which was formulated to look at this question in face of the many challenges to academic freedom across the world. And as recently as March 23, this working group formulates a set of principles going on to describe academic freedom not just as a right, but also a duty. Now, what is the justification? That's not in the UN document. The justification for designating it a right is this, or at least this is my view. Academics have this right because there is social value in the scientific research they do, and scientific here in the broadest sense, encompassing the social sciences and the humanities also. Because there is social value in the application of this knowledge to the problems of society, because there is social value in the scientific training that they give to the next generation and the next, and because the scientific progress they enable, progress over time, is of value to society. And this scholarship that has social value is only possible if academics are free from external pressure, whatever its source may be. Second, credible scholarship must be independent. So what standard do we typically expect of credible scholarship, of scholarship we can trust? It would be fair to say that we expect scholarship of this kind to be objective, to be based on irrefutable evidence, to be unbiased, unmotivated by particular interests. For this, it needs to be free not only of state power and private capital, but also of other organized interests like religion, and of course, personal prejudice based on caste, gender, and so on. It should not, indeed cannot afford to be seen to be serving the needs of or furthering any particular agenda. Now, there's one obvious exception to this, advising governments for development or nation building, which is something that the academy in every country, even in the most developed countries, have done. Based on scholarship, and this is typically not seen as state interference or a curtailment of academic freedom. In the US, this phenomenon has been called the service intellectual, professors who lent their expertise to the government, often with progressive intent, such as at the time of the New Deal. In newly post-independent India, too, the legitimacy of such intellectuals came from their contributions to planning for economic development and to scientific achievement. And it was not surprising that the leaders of higher education institutions in the early years after independence, actually for several decades, were not just exceptional academics, but also often academics who were close to government. But to return to my third point, the quality and integrity of scholarship depends upon academic freedom. Its veracity, its soundness can only be judged by the scholarly community itself, which is why the normative ideal of a university is that of a self-governing community. Academic institutions should have the absolute freedom to determine the protocols of membership in the scholarly community. This is the only way in which to protect the integrity of scholarship. Without such protections, substandard, even biased scholarship that is hostage to particular interests, could potentially be unleashed in the public domain, which would clearly not be in the public interest. So without freedom, scholarship is meaningless. Research, of course, you might ask, is necessarily dependent upon state finance. So does state financing of research compromise academic freedom? In more advanced economies, as we know, in a range of fields from medicine to defense, this role has come to be assumed by industry. And it's not a very long-standing development either, 40, 50 years. But in countries like ours, the state still plays a dominant role in funding research, even if that funding is rather low and much less than we would like. As even the new education policy 2020 acknowledged, India's spending on research is only 0.69% of GDP. And this has been the case for about 2 decades. And it's much lower than the 3% that the country's scientists have been asking for. But even of this 0.69%, 2 or 3 of the biggest spenders are atomic energy and space. So finance, yes, but over and above finance, scholarship needs to be supported by an enlightened society, by people like you. An enlightened society that recognizes the value of scholarship, that recognizes the value of free inquiry. Fourth, a university needs academic freedom because, on the one hand, its job is to produce knowledge and certainty, and on the other hand, its job is also to promote uncertainty, even radical uncertainty. As the sociologist long ago, Edward Shills, put it, the scholarly enterprise is about study and rational reflection to give birth to new ideas. It's also to appreciate old ideas in a more critical way and to discard unsound ideas. The conventional wisdom is that the university is engaged in the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake and in the pursuit of truth. The biggest challenge today is that we live in times that are profoundly hostile to the very idea of serious reflection and thinking, to truth, to knowledge. All these have been instrumentalized for political purposes. The pursuit of knowledge for its own sake no longer has any meaning or value. The 21st century equivalent of the old-fashioned idea of the pursuit of truth is presumably the idea of knowledge production, much more neutral phrase, but also less probably inspiring phrase. This does not make any truth claims. It perhaps implicitly recognizes the intrinsic impermanence of truths generated through research. These can be questioned, they should be questioned, because that's how advances in scholarship occur, through interrogating established knowledge, but, and the but is very important, but in ways that do not entail compromises with the integrity of scholarship. So the establishment of rival truths, contesting truths, can only be done by using accepted, recognized methods that are ethical, objective, rigorous, and in conformity with the protocols of the discipline in question. In the current context, all of this is compromised. The idea of the interrogation of received knowledge, but also of the methods by which to establish a different truth following accepted disciplinary protocols. Hence, school textbooks can be rewritten in a way that interchanges the victors and the losers, right? That happens every day. But this Ideally, it should be a dispute that only professional historians can arbitrate the truth of, or of rival versions indeed, not because of the ideological convictions of groups who are weaponizing their political positions of dominance. In fact, in current circumstances, it may be relevant, even if banal, to ask the question, should such interrogations of knowledge then coincide with the election cycle? Can there be a new truth every 5 years following election verdicts? That may be one problem that one nation, one election may be able to resolve fruitfully. Anyway, but to return to the question of why a university needs academic freedom, as I said, the university is the preeminent site of a creative tension between, on the one hand, the quest for certitude in knowledge, and, on the other hand, the premise of uncertainty that has to characterize the impulse to interrogate those certitudes, to challenge them, to modify their truth claims, sometimes even displace them with newer truths. All these, of course, as I said, following the accepted protocols of knowledge creation, conforming to accepted standards of what constitutes knowledge. And this, I must add, is quite different from what passes as alternative within quotes decolonized knowledge these days. The bizarre assertions that use political hegemony rather than the protocols of academic disciplines to validate them. Take the conventional wisdom that ancient Athens was the birthplace of democracy. The word democracy does actually have Greek origins, but in the late 20th century, some evidence appeared of older sort of democratic forms of government in Africa and what is now the Middle East. Most recently, we have learned, not from historians, but from the state, that India has laid claim to the exclusive title of progenitor, the mother of democracy. As far as the scholarly basis for this claim is concerned, I cannot answer this. I am not a historian of anything. I am a student of democracy, but if you're interested, then at least 2 eminent scholars have weighed in on this in the India Forum very recently. But let me limit my remark to the booklet on the subject published by the Indian Council of Historical Research about a year ago. Democracy is here defined simply as non-monarchical institutions. I don't think that would pass any test of any definition of democracy, even for a class 4 student. The absence of monarchy equals democracy. We are told that ancient polities were monarchical, but only in form. They were actually democratic in spirit. In their mores and conventions, they were democratic, and so they would be best described as kingly democracies. There is also an assumption that India was, geographically, historically, from the beginning of time, one territorial nation, that unlike ancient Greece and Rome, Bharat's ancient civilization was egalitarian. There is no mention of aristocracies. Heaven forbid there should be any mention of caste. But ultimately, the claim, a deeply questionable claim, is that India today is the world's largest working democracy, okay, because the Indian people have been infused with the spirit of equality since Vedic times, a Lok-tantric parampara. All other ancient civilizations are historical, they are history. Only this one lives and breathes and manifests continuity. So you know, I think the point is made. Anyway, I leave it to you to judge if any of these speculative assertions, I can actually give you one more example if I have time. One moment. Even in Harappan civilization, democracy has been sort of interpreted into Harappan civilization. How? In the nature of town planning. And why? Because the absence in Harappan town planning, the absence of convincing archaeological evidence regarding a rigid system of socio-political stratification. That absence gives rise to the assumption that that was a democratic society. Now, you could interpret it at best as indicating that it may have been an egalitarian society, but surely you would need more robust evidence to interpret it as democratic. Anyway, 5th, the debate about academic freedom typically gets centered on the rights and freedoms of faculty. But academic freedom and unfreedom affect students as much as they do faculty. In the global north, this has taken the form of a very divisive debate about wokeness and cancel culture, about tolerance for liberal speakers, not for conservative speakers, about disinviting people, deplatforming people, and so on. In the global south, from South Asia to South Africa, academic freedom has been a burning issue for students who have been, as our own experience shows as well as data on scholars at risk shows, arrested and incarcerated for even 1,000 days, not only for exercising their legitimate right as citizens to speak truth to power, but even just for protesting tuition fees and hostel fees. From the active political participation of students in the national movement, we have come to a situation in an independent nation of 70 years where university students are infantilized on the one hand and deprived of even their basic rights of citizenship on the other. The question is, what is a reasonable expectation for a student to have when they come to university, and how integral is academic freedom to that expectation, right? At the cusp of adolescence and adulthood, a student is engaging with ideas, including abstract ideas, discovering the meaning of life and of the world by exploring the world of knowledge over centuries of human learning and thinking and interpretation, and above all, learning to question all certitudes, but based on reason, argument, and fact. It is the university that affords young people with such opportunities. To curtail their access to diverse, even subversive ideas is to do them injustice. Allowing them the freedom to explore only a limited range of books and ideas deemed acceptable is a form of censorship, which, as we now know, is generally motivated by a desire to exact obedience and conformity. These are not the attributes of a free society. They negate the very purpose of a university, which is supposed to be the site for a free exchange of ideas. In conclusion, let me turn very quickly to three features of the contemporary discourse on higher education, features that have implications, significant implications for academic freedom and for the future of scholarship. First, great deal of emphasis today on university excellence, begging the question of, can university excellence be achieved without academic freedom? Of course, excellence in this sense, or eminence in our context, essentially means rankings. Now, rankings have been justly criticized for various reasons, among them that they do not include academic freedom as an indicator, which is how both of the world's most reputed ranking agencies, QS and the Times Higher Education, end up including two of China's universities in the world's top 25. Notwithstanding the ways in which independent thought and expression are seriously curtailed in that country. But let's look at it the other way. To sustain the claim that academic freedom is a critical condition for a university to thrive, it would be interesting to look at how many excellent universities we see in non-democratic or quasi-democratic countries. Remember the tie-up between Yale University and the National University of Singapore? Well, it collapsed on precisely this ground. More tellingly, on the Academic Freedom Index, Singapore is in the bottom 30 to 40% band. We are now in the 20 to 30% band. Singapore is in the 30 to 40% band. It's closer to Vietnam than it is to Taiwan or South Korea. And a survey conducted in 2021 by an independent collective of Singaporean scholars found all kinds of restrictions in operation, obstacles in politically sensitive research and teaching, with researchers being asked to modify or withdraw their research findings for administrative reasons, people with a record of engagement in civil society or doing political commentary being blacklisted for employment or for career progression if they were already in employment, refusal of security clearances from government for these people, the political vetting of university personnel, and so on. The report, by the way, was discussed in the Singapore Parliament, but to no avail. Second, and continuing with Singapore for a minute, Singapore has high-quality research and teaching in the sciences, but it is underproductive in the humanities and social science. This tendency, the disproportionately adverse impact of the denial of academic freedom on the social sciences and humanities is increasingly becoming evident in other countries too, including our own. And this is the second feature to which I want to draw our attention. If you look at rankings, again, the Indian institutions that have figured in the top 200, but mostly in the 250 to 500 band, in the QS global rankings are the Indian Institutes of Science and the IITs, rather than the universities where there is a greater emphasis on humanities and social sciences. By the way, for the last 4 years, 6 IITs have boycotted the Times Higher Education rankings on the grounds that the indicators lack transparency. But funding for social science research is a tiny fraction of the funding for research in STEM subjects. We don't actually have, sadly, reliable or up-to-date data on this, at least to the best of my knowledge. But one piece of journalistic research showed 10, 12 years ago that the funding for the Indian Council of Social Science Research was barely 2.3% of the amount given to the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, and that only less than 12% of the UGC's research funding was allocated in the social sciences. This was in 2009-10. Now, it could be the desire to figure in the global rankings that propels the emphasis on STEM research, or it could be the justifiable apprehension that critique and dissent are more likely to emanate from the humanistic disciplines. It is definitely the case that faculty and students in the social sciences and humanities are more likely to articulate dissent and therefore more likely to be surveilled, censored, punished than those who teach physics or mathematics, with honorable exceptions. And finally, I'd like to remark on a very contemporary phenomenon, the unhappy convergence between neoliberalism and neo-nationalism that does not bode well for academic freedom going forward. It's indisputable that reduced state funding for public universities has gone hand in hand with greater and more oppressive state control, not just over the governance of universities, but even the content of teaching and learning. So you have a neoliberal project which believes that universities should raise their own revenue in order to get autonomy. This has been the wisdom for the last 10 years or so. But at the same time, greater state control over universities. The reduction of funding is driven by neoliberalism, the expanding control by neo-nationalism. And contrary to what we might expect, there is no contradiction between these two. In the global north, students have already been transformed into customers of higher education as a commodity. In countries like ours too, with higher education increasingly being rendered a private rather than a public good, public universities have been experiencing a massive resource crunch, with higher education stagnating at about 1.5% of GDP. And approximately 60% of that budget goes to institutions attended by only 6% of Indian students. So 60% of that funding is taken by 6% of the students at the IITs, the IIMs, and central universities, while 94% of India's students attend state universities or other institutions where the resource crunch is extremely acute, and you see that in crumbling infrastructure, in the adjunctification of faculty, and so on. I mean, the extent of the contractualization of academic labor is mind-boggling, but perfectly understandable. It makes sense because it reduces the financial liability of universities and of the state. So it's not surprising that as a response to a parliament question in August, just last month, unfilled vacancies in central universities still remain at 41%. This is just central universities. So just as there is no tension between neoliberalism and greater government control of universities, there is similarly no tension between restrictions and controls on academic freedom in a neoliberal project, and we assume that neoliberals are wedded to the idea of freedom, but not necessarily to academic freedom, it would appear. The driving force here being the neo-nationalist project, which has led to attacks on universities, as we all know, as hubs of dissent, producers of motivated research, insufficiently nationalist in the terms in which nationalism is currently defined. So if, in some remote future, liberal democracy comes to be strengthened, we may see a recovery of some of our academic freedoms as well. In my view, however, so long as the structural features of university autonomy remain unreformed, substantive academic freedom will remain elusive. But I'd be happy with even the limited version for the present. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jayal. We now open your session to question and answer. I see one hand here. Jasween? Yeah. I am going to take the next question.
Recently, a Center for Ancient Knowledge Systems has been set up at IIT Guwahati, maybe the other IITs also. And under the aegis of that, recently a workshop was held, proposed to be held, on the various theories of cow science. How does that reflect on academic freedom?
Would you like to answer this and we take the next question?
No, let me collect a few.
Okay. Yeah. I see one hand up there. Yes, that corner. Please stand. No, not you. The one next to you. I'm sorry, I have to disappoint a lot of you. Yeah, go ahead.
So, could you just also throw some light on the new educational policy and how does that going to help in the academic freedom? And we see in the recent past there are a lot of mushrooming of private universities, taking the space of higher education. So, do they also allow academic freedom as such? Thank you.
There's one hand right at the back near the projector in the center. Yes, please stand up. Short question, please.
Namaste, Neeraji. My question is that the Britishers used the Indian education system for ideological subversion and how it is relevant now. And as you were mentioning about the democracy, we didn't see the imprint of Vaishali, which is the largest democracy at its time, and the capital punishment also was to construct the dams and bridges, which was ultimately benefiting the people at that time. So, needed the view of yours on that. Thank you.
I see one hand right there at the back. I think it's a girl there. Yes, please. Volunteers, can you please pass a mic there?
Hello, ma'am. I just feel like what are the differences we see in the academic freedom, like when we compare to the state and the central parts of the institutions, we find the differences. Like, why do you think we find those differences in the academic freedom?
Are you asking why there are differences, or
Yeah.
are you asking about academic freedom?
No, I'm asking about why there are differences in the academic freedom.
And one final question here, third row. That's all. I'm sorry. We'll take your questions later. I'm so sorry.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for a wonderful talk. Ma'am, in the name of academic freedom, a few scholars are reinterpreting the history and trying to change the syllabus in our education system. How do you look at it, ma'am? And also, Louis Althusser says that education acts as ideological state apparatus, and recently government adopted national education policy. And what are the changes?
Sorry, what was Althusser to do with the national education policy?
No, ma'am. Education acts as ideological state apparatus, right. And
right.
Indian government adopted national education policy. Right. How do you look at it? And is there any changes needed in our national education policy recently adopted in 2020? Thank you very much.
One more?
Can we give the mic to Sujata there? Sujata, oh, you do? Okay.
Thank you. My question is, what will be your advice for the students, or rather the research scholars who will be entering the academic arena in the event of shrinking academic freedom, which you just highlighted?
Okay. Yeah?
Yes, please.
As far as the IIT Guwahati and other, I mean, this is something that has happened in other IITs as well, I gather. And we've been reading about this over time. I mean, the point is that there is a certain context in which these initiatives are being undertaken. Academics were free to do these, undertake such initiatives, for the last 50 years before that as well, but they did not. And the fact that they did not tells us something. We don't know whether it's funding or other forms of pressure and in that I would say my own fraternity of academics, we too are complicit very often. So, to what extent ancient knowledge is a legitimate subject of study? The question is, what are the terms on which it is being studied? What are the questions that are being asked of it? How rigorously is it being studied, and to what end? So those questions are also important. And I think academics have to make up their minds as to which path they're going to pursue. Second, there were lots of people asking me about the new education policy. How will it help academic freedom? It won't. Why will a new education policy help academic freedom? The word does not find a mention, and I've written about this also in the India Forum, the phrase does not find mention, as far as I can recall, in the new educational policy. As far as private universities are concerned, I think we all read the newspapers and we all know that they themselves are subject to some pressures of a slightly more indirect kind, perhaps, but pressures all the same. So academic freedom is not safe anywhere, as it happens, whether in the public or in the private sphere of higher education. The question about the British set up universities for ideological subversion, I'm not sure where you're getting that from or what the evidence for that is. There were lots of other motivations, certainly to produce a cadre of clerks for the British administration in India. Some of it was motivated, lots of scholars have written about this. I'm not the last word on the subject, but people like Gauri Vishwanathan, Sanjay Seth, many other people have written about the motivations, and that's not a field of expertise that I have. But I think that the ideological subversion in Indian universities established by the colonial government was actually mobilized by and triggered by the national movement. It was Gandhi's call to students that's where the subversion came from. It was not the British who who established them for subversion. The subversion happened within these universities, which were set up by the British. That's one way of looking at it. You might like to consider it. I don't know anything about Vaishali and what can capital punishment have to do with dams and bridges? If you're dead, how do you build dams and bridges? Sorry. State and central universities and the differences between them, this is a very large question, and I don't know how to answer it, but I will answer it from the perspective of academic freedom issues. Academic freedom is not safe even in state universities. It's across the board. State universities, central universities, there is a long list of instances of the denial of academic freedom in state universities as well. In some places, faculties and administrations of universities are a little more resilient. They come forward, they push back, and some states they don't. That might be a difference, but challenges to academic freedom exist everywhere. And I don't think changes in the syllabi, what was the question here? The changes in the syllabi have been made in the name of academic freedom. Yeah, but like I said in my talk, the protocols of disciplines of knowledge, of creating knowledge, producing knowledge, of refuting a prior thesis, those have to be followed. And in my understanding, none of these have so far been done. If there is new knowledge based on and conforming to, in accordance with the protocols of the discipline in question, then of course we must look at it seriously and with an open mind, no question about that, right? Advice to research scholars, hard to say. Do your best to produce scholarship that is reliable, that has integrity, that is credible, that is honest, and if there are challenges along the way, combat them. My answer would be in the same spirit as the answer that Justice Muralidhar gave, his last answer to the audience on that question, which is why you just have to keep on doing it. You have to keep on doing what you're meant to do and what you're supposed to do and what you want to do, and to do it as rigorously, objectively as you can, and to do it, to the highest standards of scholarship. But let those standards of scholarship be those that have been determined by the scholarly community, not by outside agencies. Thank you. Thanks so much.